They called him D.B. Cooper, a name that never belonged to a man, but to a ghost who left behind a sweater, a ransom, and 100 questions. On a wet November afternoon in 1971, a quiet commuter flight took off from Portland bound for Seattle. Somewhere over the Cascades, a stranger in a raincoat and sunglasses handed a note to a flight attendant. He asked for a favor, and then for the plane to land. What happened next would become one of the strangest vanishings in American history. He moved like an ordinary man, and yet he carried certainty. He smoked Chesterfields, ordered bourbon, and asked for a seat in the back, the image of mid-century anonymity. When he slid the flimsy paper across the service cart, the cabin felt small and ordinary. The note felt like a weight. He claimed he had a bomb. He demanded $40,000, 4 parachutes, and a fuel stop in Seattle. The airline obliged. The city complied. The world watched the quiet negotiation of a man who preferred to speak through gestures rather than revelations. They called him a terrorist, an enigma, a folk legend. Journalists inked headlines. Late-night comedians spun his image into myth. But the formal record is smaller, stranger. A man in a dark suit walks out of an airport with a suitcase of cash, boards a plane, and then, somewhere between Seattle and Reno, disappears into the night. No body. No plane wreckage. Just a seat with a missing man in 6 feet of open sky. The first shock was how ordinary the mechanics seemed. This wasn't a blockbuster heist. It was an intimate, terrifying negotiation between one person and 12 crew members and a handful of passengers. Yet it exposed weaknesses, not just in airline security at the time, but in how our systems assumed the world is rational and controllable. The FBI called it a skyjacking. The nation called it a puzzle. Investigators chased leads like constellations. Witness descriptions narrowed to a few details: mid-40s, clean-cut, with a calm voice. His alias, Dan Cooper, became DB when a reporter misread a file. They analyzed the ransom bills, traced the parachutes, dug through the man's possible past. Ordinary lives suddenly became evidence: the waiter who served him, the attendant who spoke to him, the crew who begged him to stay in his seat. Each recollection added texture but not closure. There were hints that mattered: a tie clipped to a neck, a cigarette stub, a cigarette smoke taste on the cabin air. There were larger clues, too: the choice of flight path, the weather, the time of day. Every theory invited images you could almost see in a movie: a man leaping into a storm with a suitcase of cash held tight, a parachute failing, a life erased by wind and cold. But every one of those images dissolved when you began to test them against what we know about survival, terrain, and human error. Over the years, amateur sleuths became as numerous as official detectives. Farmers, retired undertakers, a boy who found a decayed packet of ransom bills near a creek. Each discovery spun fresh possibility. Some leads were hopeful because they were human: a letter from a man who confessed on his deathbed, a scatter of notes found in a riverbank. Others were cruel, false arrests, men whose lives were briefly, painfully illuminated by rumor. For the victims of these mistakes, the real crime was the way a mystery can break open ordinary peace. Experts who examined the case later would argue, convincingly, that the wind could have taken a parachuting man in unpredictable ways, that the money itself would have been nearly impossible to keep clean for long, that survival in that particular stretch of wilderness is a narrow, tenuous thing. Still, the human imagination prefers narrative with a protagonist. We want to know whether the man started a new life, fled to some Pacific island under an assumed name, or simply vanished into the elements. Each outcome tells us something different about risk, regret, and identity. Perhaps the most haunting detail is what he left behind. Not just the sweater found in a river later, or the snippets of armor that washed ashore, but the idea of a person choosing to cut all ties and step into possibility. There is a kind of brutal poetry in that. A man who could have taken a million roads chose the narrowest one, and in doing so, asked the world to keep his secret. And what does that secret mean today? We live in an era when surveillance is omnipresent and anonymity is a relic. The Cooper case reads now like a relic of a different century, when a man could purchase a one-way ticket and craft a legend. The story also forces us to confront how we respond to mystery, with conspiracy, with systems of control, with the quiet dignity of the people who lived through it. The flight crew who did what they could, the investigators who refused to accept a tidy ending, the family members who waited without closure. Their lives were altered, in ways both public and private. In the end, the Cooper case resists tidy answers. It refuses the comfort of a solved equation. Maybe that is why the story endures. It is less about the jump and more about the choice to vanish. It is a question of identity, who we are when no one watches, and a question about the limits of our ability to find truth when it chooses not to be found. There is a final, quieter thought: mysteries are not merely puzzles to be solved, they are stories that live inside us. We are drawn to them because they make us imagine what we would do, what we would be willing to risk, and what we would be desperate to escape. D.B. Cooper remains an absence that taught us to look closer, to listen to seams, and maybe, to accept that some stories keep their secrets So when you think of that rainy November sky, picture not a caricature or a villain, but a human being at a crossroads. Picture the people whose ordinary day was transformed into legend, and picture the lone, patient work of those who tried to bring closure. The plane took off, and then, for one man, another life began or ended in the dark. The rest of us keep searching, because in searching we remember what it means to be both fragile and fiercely alive.